Great, we're live. My name is Alex Beamish, and this is the May broadcast of the Toronto Perlmongers monthly meeting. We've got two presentations scheduled, my own and Sergio's. Sergio is not here yet, so hopefully he arrives before my presentation ends so that he can take over the second slot. All right, and now I'm going to share my screen. And now, there's nothing up my sleeve. Okay. Are people seeing that, or is it flickering for you as well?
Flicker.
Flickering.
All right, thank you. Okay, plan B.
Well, it worked great when there was only the two of us.
Yeah, I think it's a bandwidth thing, and that could be the Google issue. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, I just need to figure out how I can. I want to be able to look up my notes while I do this. So I'm moving my notes to the alternative screen. And this screen, I'm going to go into full screen in a minute. But first, I'm going to share my screen. Screen share. We're going to share this one. And then I will switch to here. Okay, can you see the opening screen?
Yep, that's good and no flicker.
Okay, well, as usual, these meetings wouldn't be the same without some sort of AV confusion. And I think I understand why, because the big screen I was using to present is a larger screen, and it could be it's taking too much horsepower to shrink that anyway. All righty. So this is a talk about go-tos, and there was a paper long ago called Go-tos Considered Harmful, which talked about how go-tos were a bad thing. And then there were counter-arguments that said, no, there are certain cases where you need to have go-tos to avoid, tortuous multi-level logic. Anyway, so I was on Perlmongers one day, and this thing came up, and somebody mentioned go-to statements. If somebody's mic is on, could they mute it? I'm hearing some sound. Wonderful, thank you. I guess I'll take questions. I'll get to a certain point and I'll stop and see if there are any questions. Right, so here's the code, which is basically it's like a two-stage memory allocation. You come in and there's an allocation, and if that fails, you get out. Otherwise, you allocate another thing. Aha! And if that fails, then you have to do this complicated thing where you free the second block. No, you free the first block, and then you get out returning null. So this led me to thought experiment, which was how could we answer the question? Of course, there are lots of different ways. Hubris enters stage left. So we could use go-tos. We could get rid of go-tos just by doing returns from a bunch of different locations. To me, this is a perfectly acceptable solution. The downside is that we're returning from multiple locations. This brings it down to returning just from a single location. And the indentation is not too bad. So then the response to that was, well, there might be a third, there might be a fourth allocation. Perhaps a data structure where internally there are 3 more pointers. And I added a graphic so this presentation wouldn't look too left-brained. So this is starting to get pathological, but we might be able to make a Perlmongers talk out of it. Who knows? So in any case, we don't worry about memory allocation in Perl. That's only a problem in C. The music was supposed to play. That was really just my excuse to see if I could include a video in the presentation. Okay. Yeah, Rocky. Sylvester Stallone wrote the screenplay for Rocky in 3.5 days, which is pretty incredible. I mean, these days it probably takes a team of writers months to write a screenplay. This is just a little tangent. It won't take too long. United Artists really like the screenplay, and they're ready to make a picture deal with a star like Robert Redford in the lead. Stallone, however, insisted that he be casted in the lead. It was that or no deal. So United Artists, they kind of like the story. So to limit their exposure, they set him a budget of just $1 million for the entire movie. $1 million, that's it. And for them, it was like, if it was a flop, it's only $1 million. And meanwhile, they're working on this really big blockbuster called New York, New York with Robert De Niro, I think it was. If anybody remembers New York, New York, it did not do well. Rocky went on to earn $225 million, and there were 7 sequels. Yo, Adrian. Okay, so let's write some C. So I have some experience writing C. That's what I did before Perl. And of course, having written Perl for 20 plus years, there are certain memory things that you get used to doing. Include statements, unlike use statements, include statements don't need a semicolon at the end. Well, of course. Variables don't use sigils. They look naked, and I worry. But it's okay, it compiles. Writing make files, that is not trivial. Well, I mean, I started from something and changed it around, but it was still a little weird. But in the end, they're like, wow, these are great. There are no trailing commas in lists. You can get away with that. That's syntactic sugar in Perl. Very handy. And there are a number of times when I would use print, and the C compiler would immediately say, there's no such thing. And pointers to pointers, you need to dereference a pointer. Haven't had to do that in a while. And I use function pointers because that's kind of cool. Now, the thing that C doesn't have is any test infrastructure. So apart from the assert statement. So here's an example of some code where I do a string copy, and then I do a string compare and do an assertion to make sure it's correct. The bad news is that if a test fails, it core dumps. So it's either everything works or boom, you've got a core dump. Oh, it's okay. This is just a toy program. So I want to write some code. So I want to write a piece of library code that everybody else uses, just because I like the concept of having a library. So then you can link it in with everything else. So I have a library code, I have source code, and I make these executables. Each executable's got its own make file. Yeah, I could have put them into one big make file. I didn't. And then a shell script runs all the make files and then all the test programs. So here's my plan. So I'm going to build a structure which will have a block size, how big each block needs to be, and then a function callback. And the function callback will be used to do any initializations required for that block. So that we're gonna, and here's the interface. Just allocate with callbacks. So there are 3 parameters here. There's a pointer to a void pointer for the main allocation. There's a pointer to the array of functions, array of structures that we have here. And we've got a function pointer at the end. And I'll explain that in a minute. Yeah, so here's the allocation block structure. So here's the plan. We'll loop over the allocation blocks, allocating memory using the malloc or the standard one. Sorry. So the function pointer. So here's the function pointer, which we're going to, and obviously I didn't explain this. Oh, it's in my notes. Look at that. One of the parameters to our library function will be a function pointer to our own version of malloc. That way we can control whether it's our code, whether our code will use the real function or our own function, which we can schedule to fail at some point as part of the test process. Read your notes. Oh boy. So here's the logic. Allocate the memory using either our own malloc or the standard one. And if it's successful, we save the address in a list, call the callback function, and at the end, did we finish successfully? If not, free the allocated blocks and clear the main pointer. So I'd gotten to that point a couple of weeks ago and thought I was being pretty clever. And then I was on Twitter and saw this post and was thinking about it, how this developer had used heap information after freeing it, which is a bad thing. So instead of calling the callback function as I allocate the blocks, I save them all on the list and then call the callbacks after all the successful allocations. Because if I call a callback and then one of the later allocations fails, that's going to be a problem. We're going to be left in kind of an indeterminate state. Anyway, so this is the library code. And so we've got our parameters up here. Here we're using a function pointer to either go with the function pointer that was passed in, or if it wasn't null, then the standard malloc. And here's a loop going through each of the allocation blocks. We do our allocation. If it was null, we break. Otherwise, we save it in the list. And if it was the head allocation, then we save that head allocation to the pointer to the void pointer. And then here at the end, if we didn't get to the end of the list where the size was 0, we had to go and free each of the blocks and set the pointer to nothing. Otherwise, it worked, and we have to do the callbacks. And this is a test program. So we've got our array of allocation blocks here, 24 bytes for the first one and 120 bytes for the second one with a callback function, which is up here. And all we're doing is we're asserting that the pointer is not null, and we're copying it to this local pointer here, and block 1. And this is block 0, which is the one that we call in down here. And this just, so here we are checking the pointers are okay. And here we are doing string copies and making sure the string copies worked. And then at the end, we free each of the blocks. So I just want to pause here and see how people are going. Are there any comments so far? Any questions? Doesn't the assert have a way of describing the test? That's a good question. I would have to check. I think when I looked on the man page, the answer was no. All that it dumps out is, oh, this assertion failed at this line in this file. And it's a macro anyway, so basically it takes underbar line, underline, double underbar line, double underbar, and the same thing for the file. So it just uses a macro to dump that out. And in fact, one of my side queries was, gee, I wonder if it would be possible to create something like test more, but for the C language. And I thought about that, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought it's going to be really difficult because you need to do it just with an object. If somebody says, here's an object file, I want you to add test more to it, that's not going to work because you need to be able to put stuff into the object file. So basically it needs to be a source level. You need to be able to turn on you need to have a compile time flag so it's compiled with a bunch of extra stuff. So it's an interesting idea, but I don't think I would. That's for another talk. Okay, my legitimate string. It could be that it defaults to the line and file. That's a really interesting thought. Okay, let me. Oh, plus file and line. Huh. All right. Well, I'll have to look again. This is share. All right. So I set up a bunch of tests. So there's test 1, test 2, test 3. There's a single block, which is kind of the trivial case. There's the double block, and there's a quad block. And so you can see the ones 1, 2, and 3 are the ones where all the mallocs work. 1, 2, and 3A, at least one of the mallocs fails, and I have to confirm that those work correctly. So finally, this is the shell script that runs the make files that build everything and then run everything. And you can see nothing, none of the asserts broke the program. Everything got to the done point. But could it be simpler? Instead of allocating a bunch of blocks, couldn't we just allocate a big piece of memory and then divide it up ourselves? The pro is the code is simpler. The con, freeing blocks could be an issue. The code that uses these blocks would have to know that only the head allocation should be freed. All the subsequent allocations could not be freed because they're not actually, they're kind of fake allocations. But I thought that's interesting. So here's a different library function, allocate once and for all, that basically just counts up all the, totals up all of the sizes and does a single allocation. And then if the allocation worked, it does all the callbacks. And here is test code that essentially does this, the test. It really pretty much looks like the other test script that I showed you. The only difference is I'm just doing freeing the single block. And so this is called 22 because it's 2 with the second approach. Anyway, and that was run in the previous one. All right, so about that original code, I finally did get around to, so the original code talked about having a pointer and then another pointer within that. So I've pretty much faked that up by having a size, creating a struct here with an int and a void pointer. And then I allocate memory for that thing. And then I also want to allocate 24 bytes and use the callback to initialize a pointer within that structure to the pointer that's being passed in. And I've got an assert here, and I've got another assert here. Yeah, I guess the second one is not required. Anyway, I ran this using the allocate with callbacks, the first library, and it works. And then there's a cleanup here, which it's one of these things where when you review your own code, it's kind of brutal because you look at it and you go, oh, this is horrible, or oh, what about this? So I assume that the pointer for the head allocation will be available. That's not necessarily the case. So I added the callback. I changed the callback, so instead of just being passing back the pointer with the block of memory, I pass in the head allocation and the second pointer, and that allows us to do any allocation, any callback that I talked about. And of course, with make files and all that stuff, everything went beautifully. So my conclusion, coding in C is awesome. It's a lot of fun to code at such a low level. Testing, not so much. When your testing infrastructure is basically either everything worked and maybe it doesn't output anything because you've got that turned off, or if the test fails and your program crashes immediately, that's pretty harsh. Perl's testing is awesome. The language's killer feature's got to be the testing philosophy and the framework. I think it's amazing. Version control is awesome. Memory allocation is hard. Be glad I didn't try that as well. Yeah, right. And a development team of one, easy to have meetings. And the cons, there's always yet another way to do things, and retrospectives are brutal. Why'd you do it that way? That's stupid. All right, and that is the end of my presentation. Feel free to turn your mics on again. I'm just looking for my co-presenter here, and I don't see him. Anyway, that was it was a really interesting wander back through developing C, and it's just something I find absolutely fascinating after having lived for many years in the Perl world, to go back and develop something in C. The last time I think I compiled something in C, it would take, I don't know, a couple of seconds or a couple of hours to compile it. Now, of course, under Linux and the machines that we have now, the compile time is, it's like 10 milliseconds or something like that. It's ridiculously quick. Alrighty, so that's my presentation, and I'm sorry to report that I do not see my co-presenter here. So you have nothing to add. All right.
Alex, maybe I could just say a bit about the upcoming conference in the cloud.
Please do.
Okay, so Perl Conference North America would have been held in Houston this year. The pandemic erased that possibility. And the organizers, who include people like Todd Rinaldo and Nicholas Rochelle-Magna and other people, particularly those people who work at cPanel in Houston, which is a major user and supporter of Perl. They negotiated with the hotel to essentially push the entire conference date back a year. And then they considered the possibility of having an all virtual conference and decided to go forward with the conference in the cloud. So this will be a 3-day conference. It will be entirely virtual. It will be entirely in Zoom, unfortunately. But that was the technology that was available to people and that people were familiar with when we reached the point where we had to make a decision as to whether to go forward or not. And by that point, everybody knew Zoom. Nobody knew StreamYard. So I guess that's why they went with Zoom. In any case, so it will be 3 days. It will be running from approximately 11 or 11:30 Eastern time until 6:30 or 7 Eastern time. They don't start early in the morning because everybody's attending virtually. And if you're attending in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, you don't want to have to get up at 5 a.m. In their time zone to catch a presentation. So the conference schedule is up, and I think there's only at most 2 tracks at any given time. They're asking a $10 registration fee, which of course you could avoid, but hey, it's only $10. And I don't honestly know whether they've posted that as only $10 US or $10 Canadian, but I'm sure they'll take your money in any case.
I'm sure it's $10 US.
Pardon me?
I'm sure it's $10 US.
Oh yeah, I know. I just don't know whether they have even considered the possibility of how to collect payments in other currencies. But in any case, it's there. It'll schedule on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, 4 weeks from this one. So, it clearly won't be as much fun as a Perl conference, formerly YAPC, typically is, but it's also going to be a lot less expensive because you don't have, you don't have airfare and hotel to consider. And particularly for you all up in Toronto, you don't have to bring your passports. So, which is actually brings up like a personal anecdote. All the times I've been to Toronto, going back to at least 1984, I've been carrying my U.S. passport, and I traveled in Canada on that passport. Then coming back from last year's Perl conference, I lost my passport, even though I wasn't traveling out of the country, but I was using it to get through TSA checkpoint and all that. So I had to frantically reapply for a U.S. passport because I was expected to attend the Perl Core Development Team Summit in Amsterdam in October. Well, eventually got the passport and I did attend that summit. But subsequently, I thought, I thought to myself, I might at some point in the future find myself in Rochester, where my birth family is, and want to just continue on the road to Toronto. And if I don't have my passport with me, I'd be in trouble, except that now in the United States, they have what's called an enhanced driver's license, which is what you need instead of a regular driver's license to get onto airplanes and to go across the Canadian border. So I decided when it came time for my license renewal, I decided I'm going to pay the extra money so that I get the enhanced license, so that if I want to go to Toronto on an impulse and I don't have my passport, I can. So I was all set to do that. And then the coronavirus epidemic intercedes, New York State closes all its Department of Motor Vehicles offices, and this enhanced license is something that you can only um, apply for at a DMV office. So I've reluctantly applied for a regular driver's license, um, which I could do online, and which came in the mail, and in which they just simply reused my last photograph. But I cannot use that to cross the Canadian border, and I cannot use that to get on an airplane. So when this epidemic subsides and they reopen New York State offices, I'm going to have to shell out for an enhanced driver's license so that I have no impediment to coming into Toronto. End of rant. But I really miss Toronto. I have not been, I've not been there since July 2016, and entering retirement and having now to live on Social Security and a little New York State pension means that to live with my income, I no longer can afford to keep a car. And the car that I traveled to in Toronto many times, was 26 years old and had to be given away. When the epidemic subsides, number one, I'm going to get that enhanced driver's license, so that I don't always have to take my passport when I'm driving around North America or taking a plane within North America. And also, I'm going to have to explore what the deals are for rental cars, such that I can rent a car and take it across the Canadian border. Because one thing I've learned the hard way is that when I rent from like a local outfit, not one of the national chains, I'm restricted as to where I can travel with that. And I know that if I rent a car from a local, used car lot, as I've done, I can't take it across the Canadian border. And I really like the flexibility of being able to go to upstate New York and then proceed from there to Toronto or even Montreal, as I've also done.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. If I am going to be taking a car across an international border, I check when I rent the car to see to confirm that that's possible. And I think between the U.S. and Canada, that should be pretty straightforward. I also borrowed somebody's car to go to Tijuana, and they made it clear to me. They said, "Don't drive into Mexico. You can park. You can park at the border and walk across. Do that." I think because his car insurance didn't cover him in Mexico. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
interesting.
I know. For example, a couple of years ago, I rented a car at the Syracuse airport, and it was from not one of the big three chains. It was from Budget or Enterprise, and they are franchises of the chains. They are not operated by the chains themselves. And so this car was restricted from going across the Canadian border, even though it was from a chain, but it wasn't from the big chains. So and of course, none of the times that I've ever driven to Toronto or Montreal have I been driving a rental. It's always been my own car. I've flown to Toronto, and that's perfectly fine because I fly into the Toronto City Island Airport, and I literally walk to the place I'm staying. But of course, that requires a bit more planning and forethought, and that's generally valid. Like Newark to Toronto, it's not valid. There's no connection Rochester to Toronto that I could do that with.
Yeah. Okay. So there was it sounds like there was a question. So Dave, go ahead with your question.
I vaguely recall for C, assert, isn't it basically something that's only active if you compile it in debug mode? Because back in the day, they didn't want to have all that test stuff slow down when you're in production.
Assert is actually defined as a macro. So, and I'm just trying to think, but I hear what you're saying. And that's something I'll have to look into. I know that in C, if you you can set up your compile time flag so that I imagine what happens is at runtime, an assert, if you set a flag a certain way, an assert would turn into a no-op. It would just disappear. But that's something I was kind of vaguely aware of, and I just thought, well, I'm not gonna be running this production. If it crashes, it crashes, and that'll mean I need to fix my logic. So I was using it kind of as a poor man's test more module.
Okay.
But yeah, I do want to look at that and also find out what other functions I think. And in fact, while I was working on the project, one of the questions I had for myself was, what else? No, where the heck is it? All right, it's not on that piece of paper. So the question I had for myself was, okay, this definition is coming from assert.h. There must be a whole pile of different assert statements in that module, include statement. And the answer is nope, there's just assert in there. But I think you can actually put a message in there. It generates no code. Yeah. Interesting. So you can see Foucault's comment there. The macro in debug is defined at the moment. Assert was last included. The macro assert generates no code, hence does nothing at all. And it looks like there's a URL from Nicholas about a C tap harness. I'm going to have to check that out. That's fascinating. Yeah, so this the initial question for my presentation came up in Perlmongers, which is why I thought this would be relevant, only tangentially relevant, because I had originally written a Perl module and then a test script against the Perl module, and I got that done in about 20 minutes, half an hour, and that was when I thought, ooh, I should try this in C, because C is really where you care about doing memory allocations. And then it became quite entertaining because I had to scrape 20 years of rust off of these various different practices that I'd used many years ago. It was quite entertaining. Okay, well, my co-presenter is not here. I'm going to have to send him a stern note saying, "Hey, you missed our meeting again." And if there's no other business, we can call it a night. Anybody have any news or anything to report? I hear the clicking of a keyboard.
No news from me. It's just nice to see everyone again.
Yeah.
For a while, so.
Yeah, great to see you guys. Hope you're all managing okay with the pandemic. I hope everybody's healthy, staying safe, washing your hands, all that good stuff.
Definitely.
All right, that's it for this month. I'll send out an email with July, what's happening in June and July, what I've already talked about, but I'll just reiterate it. And I guess if I don't see you in the cloud in June, we'll see you in July. All right, thanks all.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Yeah.